In 2018, the Turkish lira collapsed 45% in a single year. Inflation hit 85%. Ordinary people couldn't afford basic bread. Teachers were making poverty wages. The currency that once competed with the dollar became a punchline in global markets. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck or global forces beyond Turkey's control. It was a deliberate choice. A series of deliberate choices made by one man who decided economic theory was for losers and that he knew better. And those choices didn't just destroy Turkey. They rippled across the entire Muslim world. Pakistan, Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, every Muslim-majority nation that looked to Turkey as a regional power watched their own economies get dragged down too. Because when the regional hegemon collapses, everyone falls with it. Today, we're going to break down exactly how Turkey managed to destroy itself economically while simultaneously overextending itself militarily across 3 different theaters of war. And more importantly, we're going to show you why this collapse is going to hurt Muslim-majority nations for decades. If you're watching this and you want to understand why inflation is destroying the Middle East right now, why unemployment is exploding across North Africa, and why the entire Muslim world is becoming economically destabilized, subscribe. Because over the next 25 minutes, we're breaking down the exact policy decisions that caused this, the military adventures that accelerated it, and the regional consequences that nobody predicted but everyone's now experiencing. This isn't just about Turkey, this is about how one nation's catastrophic economic mismanagement becomes everyone else's problem. This is about what happens when a leader ignores every expert, fires anyone who disagrees with him, and gambles with his country's future based on his own economic theories. And most importantly, this is about understanding why the Muslim world is now facing a cascade of economic crises that started with Turkey's collapse. To understand how badly Turkey screwed this up, you need to understand what Turkey was before the collapse. After the end of the Cold War, Turkey positioned itself as the critical bridge between Europe and the Middle East. It was a secular Muslim-majority nation. It was part of NATO, the only Muslim-majority member. It had a functioning democracy, or at least something that looked like a democracy on paper. It had a real military, the second largest military in NATO. It had an economy that was genuinely growing and diversifying. By 2000, Turkey had become one of the most important geopolitical players in the entire region. Turkey was hosting American military bases. Turkey was trading with everyone. Turkey was selling drones to Azerbaijan. Turkey was sending soldiers to Somalia. Turkey was investing in Africa. Turkish companies were building infrastructure across the Arab world. Turkish banks were expanding into the Caucasus. For a moment, just a moment, Turkey felt like it could be something really big. It felt like it could be a Muslim superpower without the oil wealth of the Gulf, without the nuclear weapons of Pakistan, without the military dominance of Egypt. It was going to build itself through trade, through technology, through smart positioning between continents. By 2010, Turkey's GDP was $730 billion. Inflation was single digit. The currency was stable, unemployment was down. Young Turks were moving to Istanbul to start businesses. Real estate was booming. Everyone thought Turkey had finally figured it out. And then everything changed. Not because of external forces, because of one man and a fundamentally different understanding of how economics works on this planet. Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power in 2003 as the leader of the Justice and Development Party. For about 15 years, he was actually pretty competent. The economy grew, inflation fell, things worked, unemployment came down, real wages increased. Turkey was becoming a genuine economic success story. But around 2015, something shifted fundamentally in Erdogan's thinking. He started to believe that he didn't need economists. He started to believe that his intuition was better than economic theory. He started to believe that the conventional economic wisdom that had worked for decades was actually designed to keep countries like Turkey suppressed. This is where the story gets genuinely dangerous. Erdogan started making statements like, if interest rates are high, inflation will be high. Therefore, I will lower interest rates to bring down inflation. Every economist on the planet said this backwards. Lower interest rates increase inflation. It's basic monetary policy. It's been true for 50 years. But Erdogan was convinced that conventional wisdom was wrong. He was convinced that Western economists had it backwards on purpose, to keep Muslim nations economically weak. He was convinced that his way would work better. So he did it anyway. He fired central bank governors who disagreed with him and appointed central bank governors who would do what he wanted. He started publicly pressuring the bank to lower rates even as inflation was accelerating rapidly. He would make public statements criticizing the central bank for tightening policy. He would tweet about monetary policy decisions. He created an environment where the central bank couldn't operate independently because the president's will was being forced upon them through pressure and eventually through replacement. And the tragedy is that if you look at Turkey's inflation trajectory, you can see the exact moment this policy started. The moment Erdogan took control of monetary policy, inflation started climbing. It's like watching someone make a terrible mistake in real time, and everyone around them is screaming to stop, but they just keep going, convinced they know better. This is important because it shows exactly what happened next and reveals the real problem. Between 2015 and 2023, Turkey went through 5 different central bank governors in just 8 years. 5 governors. That's extraordinary turnover. Why? Because every single time one of them tried to actually do their job, tried to implement conventional monetary policy to fight inflation, Erdogan fired them immediately. There was Erdem Baş, who got fired because he wanted to raise rates. There was Nevzat Ağbal, who raised rates aggressively in late 2021, brought inflation down from 19% to 13%, and then got fired via middle-of-the-night text message because Erdogan thought he was raising rates too much. The guy managed to actually slow inflation, and he got fired for it. There was Shahap Kavcıoğlu, who basically just did whatever Erdogan wanted, keeping rates artificially low, and inflation exploded again. The pattern is crystal clear. Turkey didn't lack competent economists. Turkey lacked a leader willing to listen to them. This matters because the central bank is supposed to be independent. That's the entire point of an independent central bank. It's supposed to make decisions based on economic reality, not political pressure. The moment a president starts firing central bank governors because they won't implement his personal economic theories, you've basically guaranteed financial collapse. It's not a matter of if anymore, it's a matter of when. But here's where it gets worse. While inflation was exploding, while the currency was collapsing, while ordinary Turkish citizens were struggling to afford basic necessities, Erdogan made another decision. He decided that Turkey needed to expand its military. Not just maintain it, expand it. In 2018, the same year the lira collapsed 45%, Turkey was spending $10.3 billion on defense. By 2022, that had increased to $13.5 billion. By 2023, annual defense spending had climbed to over $15 billion. While unemployment was rising to historic levels, while pensions were being cut in real terms, while the middle class was being decimated by inflation, Turkey was buying more weapons, more drones, more military equipment. Turkish military spending as a percentage of GDP went from 2.1% in 2018 to 2.8% in 2022 and continued climbing. For comparison, most NATO countries spend between 1.5% and 2% of GDP on defense. Turkey wasn't spending more on defense because of an external threat that suddenly appeared in 2018. Turkey wasn't threatened by NATO members or major powers. Turkey was spending more on defense because Erdogan wanted to project power. He wanted Turkey to look strong. He wanted Turkey to matter. He wanted to create a sense that Turkey was a major regional military player. So he spent money Turkey didn't have to maintain an illusion of regional dominance. And he did this in 3 different theaters of war simultaneously. First, there was Syria. Turkey invaded Syria in 2016, then again in 2018, then again in 2019. These weren't quick operations. These were ongoing military commitments with tens of thousands of troops stationed on Syrian territory, with ongoing logistics, with ongoing costs that stretched year after year. By 2023, Turkey still had over 10,000 troops in Syria, plus military bases, air bases, and a massive logistical operation. The costs were staggering. Second, there was Iraq. Turkey has been conducting military operations against Kurdish groups in northern Iraq since the 1990s, but these operations intensified significantly after 2018. Between 2015 and 2023, Turkey conducted over 200 airstrikes and drone strikes in Iraq. These weren't old operations either. Turkey had built new bases in Iraq, deployed advanced drone technology, and was conducting regular bombing campaigns. Third, there was Azerbaijan. In 2020, Turkey threw its weight behind Azerbaijan in the conflict with Armenia over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region, providing military advisors, advanced drones, and equipment. That operation lasted 44 days and cost both sides billions in military losses. Turkey deployed its latest technology, tested its newest weapon systems, and burned through enormous amounts of military resources. Turkey was essentially fighting 3 wars simultaneously, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Azerbaijan, while its economy was collapsing, while its currency was losing value every single day, and while it was running massive budget deficits that it couldn't sustain. By 2022, Turkey's foreign currency reserves had plummeted catastrophically. In 2017, Turkey had $93 billion in foreign exchange reserves, a healthy cushion. This is crucial to understand because foreign exchange reserves are the last-ditch backstop for a collapsing currency. When confidence in your currency is falling, you use your foreign exchange reserves to buy your own currency and prop up the value artificially. You use them to pay import bills when nobody wants your currency. You use them to show the world that your nation has real assets backing the currency. By 2022, Turkey's usable foreign currency reserves had dropped dramatically to around $40 billion. By mid-2023, reports suggested they were below $30 billion. The central bank had burned through over $60 billion in reserves in just 5 years. The central bank had to engage in increasingly desperate maneuvers to hide the true state of reserves. They were counting gold at inflated prices above market value. They were counting reserves that were technically supposed to be off limits. They were essentially cooking the books to make the situation look better than it actually was. Why resort to such desperate measures? Because if the world realized how few actual foreign currency reserves Turkey had, confidence in the lira would collapse entirely and immediately. Banks would stop lending in lira. Businesses would refuse to accept lira for international transactions. Foreign investors would pull their money out, and the entire financial system would seize up in a catastrophic bank run. This is what happens when a government spends money on military adventures it can't afford while simultaneously destroying its currency through disastrous monetary policy. You burn through your reserves trying to prop up the currency. You hide the truth about your reserves to maintain the fiction of stability. And eventually, even hiding it isn't enough. In May 2023, something extraordinary happened. The Turkish lira reached parity with the US dollar for the first time in history. Let me be clear about what this means because it's genuinely catastrophic. The lira, the currency of Turkey, the most important Muslim-majority nation that bridges Europe and Asia, the currency that was supposed to be a tool of regional power, was now worth exactly $1. 1-to-1. 0-1. By historical standards, this was genuinely humiliating. In 2010, you got 1.5 lira for every dollar. In 2015, you needed 2.8 lira for a dollar. By 2018, you needed 5 lira to get a dollar. By 2021, you needed 8 lira per dollar. By 2023, you needed 30 lira to get a dollar. The currency had lost 95% of its value in just 13 years. What does this actually mean for ordinary Turks and their daily lives? Imagine you bought a house in 2010 and took out a dollar-denominated loan, which was cheap because the lira was strong. By 2023, that same loan in dollar terms cost you 3 times as much to pay back because the lira had weakened so dramatically. If you had savings in lira, like most Turkish citizens do, they'd lost 95% of their purchasing power. Your life savings were essentially wiped out. If you were a retiree on a fixed pension paid in lira, you were essentially impoverished overnight. A teacher's salary that was decent in 2015 was poverty level by 2023. Workers in productive industries were fleeing the country in droves. Between 2017 and 2023, an estimated 800,000 Turks emigrated primarily to Europe and the Middle East. They were leaving Turkey because Turkey had become economically unlivable. Young people couldn't afford housing. Families couldn't afford food. The unemployment rate was officially around 8%, but real unemployment, including underemployment, was probably closer to 15-20% or higher. But here's the part nobody talks about. Turkey's economic collapse didn't happen in a vacuum. Turkey is the economic center of the broader Muslim world. Turkish companies had invested billions of dollars across the Middle East. Turkish banks had expanded into North Africa and Central Asia. Turkish contractors were building massive infrastructure projects in Egypt, in Pakistan, in the Gulf states. Turkish Airlines was a major international carrier connecting the Arab world to Europe. Turkish construction companies were the biggest exporters of construction services in the entire Muslim world, building highways, airports, ports, and housing. When Turkey's economy collapsed, all of that stopped dead. Turkish contractors couldn't access credit to finance their projects because no bank would lend to them. Turkish companies couldn't pay their foreign workers because they couldn't convert lira into foreign currency at reasonable rates. Turkish banks had to cut their international operations dramatically to preserve liquidity at home. The entire Muslim world felt the economic shockwave. Egypt, which was trying to rebuild its economy after its own currency crisis, had major construction projects halted because the Turkish contractors couldn't finance them or access materials. Pakistan, which was working with Turkish defense contractors and Turkish infrastructure companies, had to renegotiate contracts and deals because Turkey could no longer deliver on timelines it had committed to. Tunisia and Morocco, which relied on Turkish investment and Turkish expertise in their own economic development, watched that capital flow dry up completely. Smaller Muslim-majority nations in Central Asia and the Caucasus that had pegged their currencies to the lira or had significant trade exposure to Turkey got dragged down in the economic spiral too. Syria, which is bordered by Turkey and deeply dependent on Turkish trade and investment, was particularly devastated. The Syrian refugee crisis was already getting worse, and Turkey had been hosting over 3.7 million Syrian refugees. But as Turkey's economy collapsed and government revenues dried up, the government started tightening spending on refugee assistance, which meant millions of refugees lost access to housing support, healthcare, and education. Lebanon, which was already experiencing its own catastrophic economic collapse and currency crisis, had significant exposure to Turkish banks and Turkish financial institutions, and watched that exposure become toxic as Turkish currency values plummeted. The point is this: when the regional hegemon's economy collapses, everyone suffers. Turkey was supposed to be the engine of Muslim economic development. Instead, it became a massive drag on everyone else. It became an anchor pulling the entire region down. And the worst part is that this was entirely self-inflicted. This wasn't Western sanctions. This wasn't foreign invasion. This wasn't bad luck or global forces beyond anyone's control. This was a leader who thought he knew better than economists, who fired everyone who disagreed with him, who spent money on military adventures Turkey couldn't afford, and who watched his country burn while taking the entire region down with it. By 2023, Turkey's economy was in genuine crisis mode. Inflation had hit 61.5% officially, according to government statistics, though independent economists estimated real inflation was probably significantly higher, maybe 80 to 90% when accounting for actual prices that ordinary citizens were paying. The real estate market had cratered. Istanbul's property prices had halved in dollar terms because nobody wanted to own assets denominated in a currency that was collapsing in value. Unemployment was soaring beyond official statistics. Poverty rates had nearly doubled compared to just 5 years earlier. The middle class, which had been one of Turkey's proudest achievements and source of regional influence, was being systematically impoverished. Tent cities had appeared around Ankara and other major cities. People were literally sleeping on the streets in a nation that was part of the G20, in a nation that had been seen as an emerging economic powerhouse just a decade earlier. Turkish universities were losing international accreditation because brain drain was so severe that students and professors were leaving en masse. Turkish healthcare was deteriorating because the government couldn't afford to maintain hospitals or pay healthcare workers decent wages. Infrastructure wasn't being maintained because there was no money. Roads had massive potholes. Electrical grids were straining under demand. Public services that Turks had taken for granted for years were falling apart. Erdogan eventually admitted publicly that he couldn't fix this crisis alone and called elections in 2023. He lost badly, decisively beaten by the opposition coalition. A new government came to power and started implementing conventional economic policies that Erdogan had rejected, raising interest rates aggressively, fighting inflation the traditional way that every economist recommends. It was incredibly painful and unpopular with voters, but it was necessary to stop the economic freefall. By late 2024, inflation had started coming down and the currency had stabilized somewhat, but the damage was already done. Millions of Turkish citizens had been impoverished. Wealth had been destroyed. The Turkish military had been weakened by decades of operating in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan without achieving strategic objectives. Turkish regional influence had declined significantly, and the entire Muslim world had watched it happen, seen a potential regional power collapse due to poor leadership, and learned that even Muslim-majority nations that seem stable and secure can fall apart with astonishing speed. The reason we're covering this isn't just to discuss Turkish politics or point fingers at one leader. It's because Turkey is a critical case study in how quickly even seemingly stable nations can collapse when they make consistently bad decisions. Turkey had every advantage you could possibly want. It had a diversified economy with agriculture, tourism, manufacturing, and services. It had educated human capital. It had geographic advantages straddling Europe and Asia. It had military capabilities and military technology. It had diplomatic relationships across 3 continents, and it squandered all of it because one leader was convinced that his intuition mattered more than economic reality. He fired experts who disagreed with him. He ignored advice from every major economist. He spent money he didn't have on military adventures that yielded no strategic advantage. He made enemies unnecessarily through his policies, and he gambled with his country's future on the belief that he could defy the laws of economics through sheer force of will. He couldn't. You can't. Nobody can. The laws of economics are more fundamental than any individual's conviction or belief system. When a currency is collapsing because of monetary mismanagement, you can't fix it by ignoring economists and doubling down on the same policies that caused the collapse. When you're running massive budget deficits because you're spending on military adventures that drain resources, you can't maintain that trajectory indefinitely without destroying your economy. Reality catches up. It always does, and when it does, everybody suffers. Not just the leader, but millions of ordinary citizens. Turkey is a warning, a case study in how quickly strength can turn to weakness, how quickly a nation can fall from being a regional superpower to being an economic basket case, and how the consequences of poor leadership ripple across an entire region and hurt nations that had nothing to do with the bad decisions. That's the story of Turkey's collapse. A nation that had every opportunity to succeed, that had every tool available, that had the human capital and the geographic advantages and the geopolitical positioning to be genuinely important in the 21st century. And it threw it all away because one man thought he knew better than every economist on the planet. This is what that looks like when it happens. This is what the consequences are in real time. And this is what the Muslim world is still dealing with today. If you want to understand why the Muslim world's economy is struggling right now, why inflation is destroying purchasing power across the Middle East, why entire nations are falling into currency crises, then watch this entire playlist on regional economics. Understanding Turkey is the critical first step. Everything else follows from this foundation. Thank you for watching.